The message arrived without drama, without raised voices or warnings, just a line of text that carried years of quiet exclusion in a single sentence. It did not shock me, because it confirmed something I had felt long before I ever read the words. Being told I was not classy enough was not an insult as much as it was a summary of how I had always existed within my own family. I stared at the screen, not searching for a response that would change anything, but recognizing that nothing needed to be changed anymore. The message simply said out loud what had always been communicated in smaller, softer ways, that I did not fit the image they wanted to project, that my presence disrupted the picture they carefully curated for others. For years, belonging had been conditional. It depended on how well I blended into their version of success, how invisible I could make my discomfort, how small I could keep my individuality. Family gatherings were never about connection. They were performances, measured by who looked impressive and who enhanced the narrative. I learned early that my role was not to participate, but to stay out of the frame. I was invited when silence was useful and excluded when appearances mattered more. The message did not create distance. It only revealed how permanent that distance had always been. What made the moment heavy was not rejection, but clarity. I realized that I had spent too much time trying to interpret signals that were never unclear. The polite smiles, the selective invitations, the praise that flowed freely to others but reached me only in fragments. I had mistaken tolerance for acceptance and proximity for belonging. That single message stripped away the ambiguity and left only truth. I was not failing to belong. I was never meant to, at least not on their terms. There was a strange calm in that realization. When something you fear is finally confirmed, it loses its power to haunt you. I did not feel the urge to argue or defend myself. There was no need to explain my worth to people who had already decided where I stood. The absence of anger surprised me more than the message itself. It felt like standing at the edge of a long road and finally understanding that turning back would only lead to the same emptiness. Belonging, I understood then, had been used as leverage. It was offered sparingly, withdrawn easily, and always tied to compliance. The message was not about a birthday or a party. It was about control, about reminding me that access to the family's world was something I had to earn by becoming less of myself. And in that moment, I realized how little I wanted what they were offering. A seat at their table came with silence as a requirement and self-erasure as the cost. I thought about how many times I had minimized myself to stay included, how often I had swallowed disappointment to keep the peace. The message freed me from that pattern. It told me, clearly and finally, that the space I was trying to hold had never been secure. And once that truth was visible, the desire to keep proving myself disappeared. There was nothing left to negotiate. Being told I did not belong hurt only as much as it needed to, just enough to close a door I had been holding open out of habit. The message became a marker, not of loss, but of release. It ended the internal debate about whether I was imagining the distance or exaggerating the neglect. I was not. The words confirmed it without apology. In that quiet moment, I understood that belonging should never feel like permission granted by someone else. It should not require shrinking, performing, or waiting to be chosen. The message did not take anything from me. It gave me certainty. And certainty, even when painful, is a powerful thing. It allows you to stop standing in rooms where you were never meant to stay and begin building spaces where your presence is not questioned, measured, or denied. Growing up invisible did not mean being ignored completely. It meant being seen only when it was convenient, only in ways that supported the image my family wanted to present to the world. Our home was filled with polished surfaces, rehearsed conversations, and a constant awareness of how things looked from the outside. Appearances were treated like a currency, and every interaction was measured by how well it reflected on the family name. In that environment, I learned that visibility was not about being known, but about being useful to the story they wanted others to believe. From an early age, I understood that attention was selective. Praise was given generously to whatever sparkled the most, to achievements that photographed well and personalities that entertained guests. Quiet effort, inner growth, and unglamorous dreams did not earn the same recognition. I became skilled at fading into the background, not because I wanted to disappear, but because existing honestly drew disapproval. When I spoke too softly, I was dismissed as lacking confidence. When I chose interests that did not impress, they were treated as phases or flaws. Over time, it became easier to stay silent than to constantly explain myself to people who were not listening. Family gatherings felt less like moments of connection and more like staged events. Smiles were practiced, compliments rehearsed, and comparisons unavoidable. I watched how conversations shifted depending on who was present, how warmth increased in front of outsiders and cooled once the doors closed. I learned that authenticity was something to be hidden, while perfection was something to perform. Inside those rooms, I existed more as an accessory than a participant, present but not considered essential. Being invisible did not come from a lack of effort. It came from not matching the mold that had already been decided. There was little room for individuality unless it aligned with their version of success. I noticed how achievements were ranked not by personal meaning, but by public reaction. The louder the applause, the more value it carried. The quieter the pass, the less it mattered. Slowly, I internalized the belief that my worth was conditional, tied to how well I could enhance their image rather than express my own identity. What made the invisibility painful was its subtlety. There were no dramatic rejections, no outright cruelty. Instead, there were small omissions that accumulated over time, forgotten invitations, conversations that moved on without me, decisions made without my input. Each instance was easy to dismiss on its own, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I learned to accept being overlooked as normal, even expected, and that acceptance shaped how I moved through the world. Living in a family, obsessed with appearances, meant emotions were managed carefully. Discomfort was hidden, conflict avoided, and honesty softened until it lost its truth. I learned to read the room before speaking, to measure my words against how they might reflect on everyone else. That constant self-monitoring created a quiet distance inside me, a separation between who I was and who I was allowed to be. I was present, but not fully alive in their space. Over time, invisibility became a form of survival. It protected me from criticism and comparison, but it also cost me a sense of belonging. I stopped expecting understanding and settled for tolerance. I learned not to ask for too much, not to need too much, not to take up space. Yet beneath that restraint, something continued to grow. A private sense of self, shaped away from their gaze, began to take root. Growing up in that environment taught me that appearances can be louder than truth, but also more fragile. The image they worked so hard to maintain left no room for depth, only display. And while invisibility was never something I chose, it gave me a perspective they never developed. I learned to see beyond surfaces, to value substance over spectacle, and to understand that real connection does not require performance. In the end, being unseen in their world pushed me to imagine a life where visibility would not be earned by fitting in, but granted simply by being real. Building success in silence was never a strategy I planned. It was a consequence of realizing that my growth did not need an audience to be real, while others around me measured progress by applause, titles, and public approval. I learned to measure mine by consistency, discipline, and the quiet satisfaction of improving each day. I stopped announcing my plans because I noticed how often they were questioned, diminished, or compared. Silence became a space where my ideas could develop without interference, where I could work without the pressure of proving anything to anyone. They chased validation with urgency, collecting praise as if it were proof of worth. Every achievement had to be displayed, every milestone documented and shared. I watched how easily their confidence rose and fell with external reactions, how dependent it was on being seen and celebrated. In contrast, my path unfolded slowly and privately. There were no grand declarations, only long hours spent learning, failing, adjusting, and trying again. While they spoke about success, I focused on building something that could stand without explanation. Working in silence forced me to confront myself honestly. Without external encouragement, I had to decide every day whether the work mattered enough to continue. That process strengthened my resolve more than any compliment ever could. I learned to trust my own judgment, to refine my skills without needing permission or reassurance. Progress felt internal before it became visible. By the time results appeared, they were not fragile. They were rooted in effort rather than opinion. There were moments when their visible achievements made my quiet path feel insignificant. Public recognition can create the illusion that something meaningful is happening, even when it is shallow. I had to resist the temptation to compare timelines and outcomes. Their wins were immediate and celebrated, while mine were incremental and unnoticed. But over time, I realized that silence protected my momentum. There was no pressure to perform, only the responsibility to keep going. As they pursued validation, they became increasingly dependent on it. Each new accomplishment required a larger audience, a louder reaction. Without it, their confidence wavered. I observed how exhausting that cycle was, how quickly satisfaction faded once attention shifted elsewhere. My silence, on the other hand, allowed contentment to last. I was not chasing the next acknowledgement because my motivation did not come from outside myself. Success built quietly has a different texture. It grows steadily, reinforced by patience and intention. There is room for mistakes because no one is watching closely enough to judge them. I could change direction without explanation, refine ideas without embarrassment, and grow at a pace that suited me. That freedom shaped not only my work, but my sense of self. I became less reactive, less concerned with how my life looked from the outside. Eventually, the contrast became clear. What I had built in silence had substance. It did not rely on constant reinforcement to remain standing. While they were busy maintaining an image, I was building a foundation. Their validation-driven success required constant upkeep, while mine continued to function even when no one was paying attention. When recognition finally arrived, it felt secondary, almost unnecessary. The work had already proven its value to me. Building success in silence taught me that visibility is not the same as impact. The loudest paths are not always the strongest, and the quietest ones are often the most enduring. While they chased validation, I learned to value progress over praise and depth over display. In the end, silence did not hide my success. It shaped it, strengthened it, and ensured that when it finally stood in the light, it did so without needing approval to remain standing. When my family tried to claim what I built alone, it did not feel sudden or shocking. It felt like the natural continuation of a pattern I had lived with my entire life. They had never shown interest in my process, my struggles, or the years of quiet effort it took to create something meaningful. Yet the moment the results became visible, they appeared as if they had always been part of the journey. Their presence carried an unspoken assumption that success, once achieved, belonged to the family as a whole, regardless of who had carried the weight to reach it. What struck me most was the ease with which they rewrote history. Conversations shifted from polite distance to familiar ownership. They spoke as if my achievements were extensions of their guidance. Their sacrifices, their values, the years of doubt, dismissal, and absence were quietly erased, replaced with a narrative that positioned them close to the outcome while remaining far from the effort. It was not support they offered, but entitlement, the belief that blood alone granted them access to what I had earned through solitude. I realized then that recognition was not what they wanted. They wanted association. My success had become a symbol they could display, a reflection that enhanced their image. They did not ask how I had built it or what it had cost me. They only asked how it could serve them. That distinction mattered. Genuine pride seeks understanding. Their interest sought benefit. The attempt to claim my work forced me to confront a painful truth. Some people are comfortable ignoring you when you are struggling, but feel entitled to you when you are stable. They overlook the nights spent doubting, the risks taken without reassurance, the failures that taught resilience. When success finally arrives, they see only the finished structure, not the scaffolding that once held it together. My family saw a result they admired, not a process they had dismissed. There was a quiet anger in recognizing how easily my boundaries were disregarded. Assumptions replaced conversations. Decisions were made on my behalf without my consent. As if my autonomy dissolved the moment my work gained value. I felt the familiar pressure to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to accept their claims in the name of family harmony. But silence in that moment would have meant surrendering not just my work, but my identity. What I had built alone carried my values, my discipline, and my vision. Allowing it to be claimed by those who had never believed in it would have stripped it of its meaning. I understood that protecting what I created was not an act of selfishness, but of self-respect. Boundaries were not punishments. They were necessary lines drawn to preserve truth. Their reaction to resistance revealed even more. Confusion turned into offense, as though my refusal was a betrayal rather than a correction. They expected gratitude for associating themselves with my success, unable to see that their presence felt invasive rather than supportive. In that moment, it became clear how differently we understood ownership. To them, success was communal when it benefited them and individual when it did not. To me, it was personal because it had been personal to build. Claiming what I built alone was never about helping me. It was about controlling the narrative. By inserting themselves into my achievements, they could avoid confronting their past indifference. My refusal forced them to face a version of the story where they were not central. And that discomfort fueled their resentment. Walking away from that entitlement was one of the hardest decisions I made, but also one of the most necessary. I chose to protect the integrity of my work and the quiet truth of how it came to be. What I built alone did not need to be shared to be real, and it did not need their approval to remain mine. In defending it, I reclaimed not just ownership of my success, but authorship of my own story. The night truth replaced their illusion, unfolded with a strange stillness beneath all the noise. Lights were bright, voices were loud, and everything looked polished on the surface. Yet something fragile ran underneath it all. For years, they had lived comfortably inside a version of reality they carefully constructed. One where appearances mattered more than honesty and presentation carried more weight than substance. That night, the illusion finally met something it could not outshine or silence. It met truth, standing quietly but unmovable, in full view of everyone watching. As the room filled with people, laughter echoed off carefully chosen walls, and confidence flowed as easily as the drinks in their hands. The setting was designed to impress, to suggest generosity, success, and control. Guests admired what they were shown and accepted the story they were given. Illusions thrive in moments like that, where no one pauses long enough to question what they are seeing. For a while, everything worked exactly as planned. The performance held. Then the shift came, not with shouting or chaos, but with clarity. Truth does not rush. It waits for the right moment to appear whole. When it finally entered the room, it did not need embellishment or aggression. It simply existed, undeniable and documented. The confidence that had filled the space began to fracture. Smiles tightened, conversations stalled, and attention slowly redirected from spectacle to substance. The illusion could not survive scrutiny. What made the moment powerful was not embarrassment, but exposure. The carefully arranged narrative collapsed under the weight of facts that required no interpretation. In front of everyone, the gap between what was presented and what was real became visible. People who had arrived eager to celebrate began to withdraw. Not out of anger, but discomfort. No one enjoys realizing they have applauded something untrue. The illusion had depended on silence and assumption. It relied on the belief that no one would challenge it, that authority could be claimed simply by acting as if it existed. Truth disrupted that assumption. It reminded everyone in the room that ownership, integrity, and honesty cannot be performed into existence. They must be proven, and once proven false, they cannot be reassembled with charm or confidence. Watching the illusion dissolve was not satisfying in the way revenge is often imagined. There was no triumph in seeing faces change or hearing the room grow quiet. What I felt instead was a deep sense of finality. The story they had told for years no longer belonged to them. It had been replaced by a clearer one, rooted in reality rather than presentation. The power shifted not because I demanded it, but because truth reclaimed it naturally. In that moment, I understood how fragile illusions truly are. They depend on cooperation, on people choosing not to look too closely. The instant someone does, they crumble. What had once seemed intimidating and untouchable revealed itself as hollow. The confidence they wore so easily could not protect them when the facts stood exposed under the same lights meant to glorify them. As people began to leave, the noise that once filled the room drained away. What remained was a heavy silence, one that could not be softened by music or charm. That silence carried accountability. It forced recognition of what had been built on misrepresentation and what had been lost as a result. The illusion had offered comfort. Truth offered consequence. Leaving that night felt different than arriving. I did not walk away feeling victorious. I walked away feeling released. The burden of carrying a truth alone had finally been shared by everyone present. There was no longer a private injustice or a hidden imbalance. It had been seen, documented, and acknowledged. The night truth replaced their illusion was not about punishment. It was about correction. It marked the end of a story that relied on distortion and the beginning of one grounded in reality. Once truth stands openly, illusions lose their grip. They cannot demand belief anymore. And in that quiet aftermath, I realized that truth does not need to humiliate to be powerful. It only needs to be seen. Choosing distance was not an act of anger, nor was it a dramatic declaration of independence. It was a quiet decision made after understanding that peace could not exist in a space where control disguised itself as concern. For a long time, I believed that endurance was a form of loyalty, that staying connected no matter the cost proved strength and love. Letting go of that belief was the first step toward a life that belonged to me rather than one constantly shaped by the expectations and demands of others. Distance did not come easily. It carried the weight of guilt, the fear of being misunderstood, and the lingering hope that things might still change. I questioned myself often, wondering if stepping back made me selfish or cold. But every interaction that followed confirmed the same truth. Closeness came with conditions, and those conditions required silence, compliance, and sacrifice of self. Distance, by contrast, offered clarity. It allowed me to see the patterns without being pulled into them, to recognize how control had been normalized for so long that it felt like family tradition. Peace entered my life slowly, almost cautiously, as if unsure it was welcome. At first, the quiet felt unfamiliar. There were no constant messages, no subtle criticisms, no pressure to explain or defend my choices. In that space, I began to hear my own thoughts more clearly. Decisions became easier when they were no longer filtered through someone else's approval. I discovered that peace is not the absence of people, but the absence of manipulation, judgment, and emotional obligation. Living beyond their control meant redefining love. I had been taught that love demanded access and obedience, that boundaries were signs of disrespect. Choosing distance challenged those lessons. I learned that healthy connection respects autonomy and does not punish independence. By stepping away, I was not rejecting my family as people, but rejecting the version of relationship they insisted on maintaining. That distinction mattered, even if they never acknowledged it. Freedom brought unexpected grief. Letting go of control also meant letting go of the hope that they would one day understand me fully. I mourned the family I wished I had, not the one that existed. That grief was real, but it was cleaner than the constant ache of trying to be enough. Distance gave me permission to stop waiting for validation that was never coming, and to invest that energy into building a life that felt aligned and whole. As time passed, I noticed how my sense of self strengthened. Without constant interference, my confidence grew quieter but firmer. I no longer felt the urge to justify my choices or measure my success against their standards. My life expanded in directions they could not control or predict. I built relationships grounded in mutual respect, work that reflected my values, and routines that supported my well-being. Peace became less fragile and more familiar. Choosing a life beyond their control also meant accepting that I would be misunderstood. Stories were told without my input, judgments made in my absence. I learned to let those narratives exist without correcting them. Peace required restraint, the ability to walk away from explanations that would only reopen old wounds. I realized that being understood by everyone was not a requirement for living honestly. In the end, distance was not about punishment or revenge. It was about preservation. It protected the parts of me that had grown quietly despite years of pressure to conform. It allowed me to live without constant defense, to move forward without dragging the past behind me. Choosing distance, peace, and a life beyond their control was the most compassionate decision I made for myself. It did not erase the history, but it stopped it from defining my future.